Okay, so take two. When my friends came back, right when I was in the middle of recording, um, I just have to start over from the beginning. I have had controller profiles in the plugin for a while, and they've been functional, although not as useful as I think they could have been. Everyone seemed to like them a lot, so I guess there was that. I just finished expanding them over this first beginning part of this weekend because I felt they needed more, and I was adding them to the template. I should have done that a while ago, but priorities. So when I was adding them to the template, I noticed some things that I thought could be better about them, and so I implemented it. But anyways, since I never actually made a video about controller profiles, I figure I'll start at base level and go over everything for them. When OpenXR is fully implemented into UE4, this won't be as useful because OpenXR kind of natively handles this kind of thing. But for now, this will get people used to the workflow of OpenXR and actually give them a viable method of controller mapping and offsetting that they can use now, because it's a huge hassle at the moment. So let me begin. Control profiles are meant to remap buttons specific to a controller so that you can, like on Vive wands, you want grip to be trigger because it's easy to access. On touch, you want it to be grip because it's natural to hold the grip button on the touch controllers. And instead of adding branches and checks and weird things or putting into the player controller and having separate player controllers, I made a class that lets you rebind keys live during the game based on a profile that you load, and you can have multiple profiles. So for instance, I have the first person shooter pawn here, which is my test pawn, and I have action overrides on it because, I don't have a side grip to press on keyboard and mouse, so I rebind that event to middle mouse button. So let's say you were to make a game, instead of, binding, trigger to do something, you make an action command called event pickup, and you rebind event pickup to different buttons. So it's it's like a generic interface with whatever button the controller wants to use to pick up with. And that's kind of the concept here, and this is how XR is going to be in the future, where it's using this kind of concept. I wasn't aware of that when I made controller profiles, but I thought it was a good idea, and then I guess the OpenXR committee agrees because they separately came up with the same concept. So it's validating, and I like it. Okay, anyways, so we have the profile's name, controller name, FPS pawn. This is my test pawn. Socket offset transform. This is the offset that you want a grip or the controller itself, which is the expansion I just made, to happen to it. So for the FPS pawn, since naturally the FPS pawn... let me zero that out real quick. I'll zero out that. Naturally with the FPS pawn, you're gripping with this because it's easy to grip straightforward like that. It's nice, intuitive, lets you get over tops of things because it's pretty flat, so I can take the stopper off the bottle. But when you go to grip on a socket, it uses the socket transform that it has, and since I've developed the entire template off of Vive wands, that socket offset is set for Vive wand. So as you can see, it's pretty useless for an FPS pawn. It's pointing straight down. Because how you hold a Vive wand is you'd be holding it straight up like this, like an actual gun, and its natural orientation is around 70 degrees to feel natural like that. So that's where the controller profile comes in. You set the controller profile on the FPS character to a 70-degree offset to account for the difference between this controller type and the Vive wand controller type, which is what I developed everything in. And if you had developed your project in Oculus Touch, you'd have your base 0 point be Oculus Touch, and then you would set the profiles to be the offset from that. Or once I get these profiles dialed in perfectly, you could just use these settings and then it should work anyways because you're already offsetting by what the touch expects. So now when I grip this gun with the 70-degree offset, it's angled correctly because I've accounted for the difference between a Vive wand and the FPS character hands. Normally, well, not normally, but I have a new feature that I added to these where changing this offset will also change the controller's tracked transform, so you literally don't have to do anything. You set up the profile and you load the profile somewhere in code. Like in FPS, it's load controller profile by name, FPS pawn. In the Vive pawn character, I compare headsets. I compare Steam headsets separately, and I decide which profile to load. But you load the correct profile, and then there's this new feature that I just added this first part of the weekend, where there's offset by controller profile on the hands now. So if I tick this and I play the game, the left motion controller is now offset that 70 degrees up in pitch, which for FPS is kind of bad because, you know, it's awkward to grip things. But you can see what it's doing here. See how it fits more naturally to the hand, although 70 degrees isn't correct for the gun grip. It should be more like 30, but then I'd have to rotate the hand. But you see, that's what it's doing. It's actually offsetting the controller itself in the code when it gets it transformed from the tracking system. So now when you go into load a profile, if you have offset by controller profile enabled, you don't have to do anything else. You don't have to offset grips by the transform. You don't have to do anything. It just offsets for you. So the same operation will feel natural with a touch as it will with a Vive wand. The collision spheres, these red spheres on the hands, will rotate into position that's good. The text will be in the same location relative to your real-life hand as they are on the other controllers. And that's kind of the general concept. You know, the mesh hand lays out to your real-life hand the same way no matter which controller you're using because it's providing this offset. So that's what the socket offset transform is for. It's for adjustments. For things like Windows MR, I don't have any rotation currently. I think it needs a slight pitch adjustment, but only like 10 degrees. But for translation, WMR controllers have this big circle in the front of them. And the center point of the WMR tracking is actually out near the middle of that circle, which puts it far away from the hand, and it feels terrible. So I'm adding a -4 unit offset on X to bring that 0 point back farther and closer to the hand so it feels more natural and closer like where I have it set up for the Vive wand. And I also use a separate hand transform for the right hand so that I can set this Y value to separate values. I didn't want to mirror it because I don't know what kind of controllers would be out in the future, so I didn't want to just add, you know, like a mirror on Y-axis. So I have two separate possible transforms here. If you don't need a separate one, don't tick this and it won't use this. But if you do, tick it and use it. And this Y value here just offsets it towards the inside of the hand a little bit so it feels more natural in WMR controllers. I mean, that's what the offset transform does. I still have code in the normal character for adjust transform by controller profile. And that's if you're not offsetting by controller profile, you still want to offset the grip by it. So like in the case of the FPS pawn, I don't offset by controller profile because it's easier for me to collide with my hand out in the air like this. I mean, with real tracked controllers, this would be bad, but you know, with FPS pawn, I'm testing. But I still want the grip to be offset like this. So, you know, that's the whole point of me still checking that there. So that's the offsets. The offsets are great. They make it easy to do stuff. There's one caveat with it, and that is that if you're loading a procedural mesh for your motion controller, like the Steam event graph, like the Steam model loading that I implemented, or the new display device model that Epic implemented, then those procedural meshes are offset to match the 0 point of the default controller tracking. So you do have to readjust procedural meshes because they're set up for matching it, which is where this new event I added comes in. The on controller profile transform changed, and it gives you a new relative transform for procedural components, and then I just reposition those elements. That way, you know, procedural meshes still line up perfectly with the hands, but you get this cool profile loading and ability to do the logic once with any tracked system that you want, and then it to work on all systems correctly. And then I just have some. This is a new part of the template I added this weekend. I do replicate this transform just in case there's procedural components on, or you know, like equivalent components on the pawn. This could probably be removed for most people that use things like hand meshes, because obviously hand mesh isn't going to be, it's just a hand mesh. It's just offset to fit whatever fits your controller. It doesn't need to be replicated. The new tracking will do that for you. Alright, so that's offsets. It's fairly understandable. I have examples now in Vive-Pawn character. It's way cleaned up here where it was loading the controller profiles. And then this is exampled too. I have been making profiles this weekend for all the controllers I have access to. There is a difference between Oculus Touch on their home environment, which is the default loading. It'll load the Oculus plugin on the Unreal Engine. It needs about a 30-degree pitch adjustment to make it so that everything feels the same as Vive ones. On Oculus Touch Steam, it uses, I guess Steam OpenVR is already making adjustments, so you can't use the same profile across the two. In the Vive-Pawn character, I get HMD type, and then if it's Steam, I check the Steam exclusive HMD type, and then I load the correct profile depending on what that is. These profiles probably still need adjustments, but I mean, this is why I started with today, to get the profiles set up. Outside of the offset transforms, we have axis and action overrides, which are where I guess the big main cool part about this is. And it is that, let's say you have touch controllers, you generally want to pick up items with the grip button, because you can just clamp your hand and feel like you're actually gripping it. It feels good, natural. But if you're using the Vive ones, you want to use trigger, because grips are kind of hard to hold on the Vive ones, or in an awkward position, and trigger feels natural. So instead of adding like a branch by detecting what it is, or using a third-party plugin to rebind keys based on stuff, and then you have to do your own, if it's this, then rebind this key, that key, or using different player controllers, which is kind of a mess. Instead, now you can just add a controller profile for, whatever controller settings you want. So for the FPS pawn, obviously I don't have motion controller buttons, so side grip pressed L doesn't mean anything on FPS pawn, so I rebind it to middle mouse button for testing. And what these action and axis overrides do is they wipe out that event in your input structure and replace it with whatever you put in here. So if I were to delete this middle mouse button action mapping here, it would just unbind side grip pressed L entirely. Nothing would call it. So you can actually remove buttons entirely like that too, or add new events and buttons in here. Grab left, same thing. I'm grabbing with the left, so I want to use my left mouse button. Normally it would be the left trigger because that's what my Vive wand is on default. And on touch, it should be left grip button. But for FPS pawn, now it's left mouse button whenever I load my FPS pawn up. And this follows the same, thought process as OpenXR is moving towards, where, they're like, you define events and actions that the player will perform, like teleporting or gripping something or trying to grab, stuff like that, instead of, just using the button name. So I say grab left. I'm trying to grab with my left hand. I'm going to bind it to whatever button on whatever controller does that. Something cool about these profiles also is it doesn't matter if you load multiple. The last one loaded is the one that's set as current, but you can load multiple profiles before that to set different buttons up. So let's say you have like a baseline profile. This is wiping everything clean. This is the profile I want to start with. Normally, you'd have that in input. I mean, these are all my default bindings, so, that's what my base profile is. But you could have, like a Steam VR base profile. I know all controllers on Steam VR need this basic setup, so I'm going to load, controller profile, Steam VR base, and not set to the current profile. There's an option for that when you set profile. It's set as current profile. You don't do that. Don't set it as current profile, and it'll load all the bindings, but then it won't, set a bunch of backend stuff as well. And then you can load the, the specific controller profile to add additional mappings on top of that. Fine tune it with these like rebinds here. Like teleport. FPS pawn, there's no need for 2 teleports because I don't use my right hand. I mean, it doesn't matter if I use my right or left hand. I can only really point forward unless I start moving my hands around somehow. So I just rebound it to T so that when I'm playing with my FPS pawn, I can point in a direction, hold T, let go, and I'm teleporting. And that's just all achieved by loading that controller profile. I could reset that to G, although there's a lot of other keys here. I can reset to G, and then when I go and play, I press my G key, and now I'm teleporting with G. It's just that simple, and it makes things a lot quicker and easier. Like I said before, OpenXR is going to be moving to this kind of system, so eventually UE4 will get native support for this kind of thing, which is great. I'm glad I had the controller profile in long before I heard that. Felt very validated and happy when I heard that OpenXR was heading in the same direction. I'm not sure if they're going to do something like this offset system. Like I said, I believe that SteamVR currently offsets because it's a different offset for Oculus Touch on the Steam plugin as it is over Oculus Touch on the Home plugin. But like I said, UE4 by default uses the Home plugin. So unless you disable the Oculus plugin entirely, this should never occur. But I'll still have to make a profile for it for sometime. Anyways, that's the basics of the controller profiles. There's some functions exclusive to them. Controller profile, VR controller profile. You can add a controller profile, delete, overwrite, save. You probably don't need to worry about this. Most of them you'll be doing in the project settings. That's for if you want to add key rebinding and like a menu option for players. You can let them customize stuff themselves, and then you save, delete, overwrite them. It's saved in a config file that normally isn't visible, although you can add them, the category, and be visible. Just transform by controller profile, takes the base transform and adjusts it by the offset. Like I said, you need to use that in the case that you're not automatically offsetting the controller mesh. And then when you go to grip the object, you can offset by transform by controller profile instead. Let's see, what else is there? Controller profile. You can get controller profile. We'll get one by name. You can get all the controller profiles. You can get current profile, the one that's currently loaded, if there's one loaded. You can get current profile name. You can load a controller profile, which I've already showed you. I mean, by name I've showed you, but load controller profile lets you just load a specific one, which I was using in a test thing. Yeah, controller profile test. I made this. I mean, this isn't something fancy, and I don't think I'll ever publish it live. But when I was testing for Oculus Touch pitch, the easiest way I could think of, besides directly measuring my hand, which, you know, that wouldn't get me the feel of it, was I just made a widget in the level, and I placed that widget. I placed this somewhere in the level, and I walked up to it, and I turned on the laser beams and pointed at this, and I just adjusted the pitch up and down on the touch controller until it felt right in my hand. I picked up the gun, you know, I played around with everything in the level, made sure it felt good, and then I knew what pitch to set in its controller profile. So you can use the load controller profile to save one, like save the current one, and then edit it, and then load that like variable over and over to get what you want, which I do. This is going to be messy because there's just a mock-up test to get the right one, but profile edit. Oh, it's actually in the widget itself, isn't it? Yeah. Like I said, it's messy. I was just doing this to do testing, but I load the current profile on load profile. I set it to a variable, controller profile, and then I adjust the pitch on it and reload it over and over until I like it. So, I mean, you can edit profiles. You can, you know, set profiles that you save and just reuse and change during gameplay, you know, whatever you want to do. I think that's pretty much it for controller profiles, though. Let me know if I have any questions about them. I'd never gone over them in a video before, so I'm sure somebody probably needs more information about something. I felt video was more relevant than a wiki page for this particular feature. But cheers, and I'm going to make some more tutorial videos this weekend, so hopefully you can expect more.